Let's start with Ray Bran. Ray Bran died in 1976, and he felt not well this day. He was an age of 62, my age. So, and he died on a bacteria that is called since then Legionella. And with him, there died 200 other colleagues of him, all veterans, and since then we call the disease Legionnaire's disease. So the main thing do we have a pointer here? No, okay. The main thing that we have to consider that on Legionella and Legionnaire's disease, there's a big gap between reported and unreported cases. So if you look on the upper right side, you see the reported cases of England and Wales. There are 600 a year. There are not many, right? And on the downside, you see that German numbers, about 2,000 a year, not many as well. So the British Safety Council estimate an unreported cases rate of 90%. The German Robert Koch Institute of 97%. So that means we are dealing with something like between 6,000 and 50,000 cases, depending on the unreported rate. And the issue on an unreported rate, it's not exact, right? So we are talking about between 600 and 5,000 deaths a year through Legionella. Let's differentiate a bit. So we have different rules. On the left side, you see the state of the art, the drinking water rules of the UK. I hope they are correct. And these germs are obligate pathogen. That means everybody gets an infection with a certain concentration of those germs. And they are made for the general population. And usually the general population have a proper immune status. And on the right side, you see something that we have to be aware of because of all the patients in hospitals or on clinical side, they are not have a proper immune status, they are immune weak or immune compromised. So we're talking about Acinetobacter, we were talking about non-tuberculosis mycobacteria. We are talking about Pseudomonas aeruginosa, we heard that today. And we are talking about multi-resistant gram-negative germs as well. And vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus. So these are the germs we have to focus on in the clinical setting. I brought some numbers with me with some exceeding limits from German numbers. So they take samples from 90 hospitals in Germany, and you see we have a limit in Legionella. They are 100 CFU per 100 mil, and 50% of the hospital exceeding these limits. Elderly homes as well, kindergarten, schools, and so on. So, but the interesting thing here is that Pseudomonas, and we heard about that, 30% exceeding those limits as well. So we have a problem not only with Legionella, we have a problem with Pseudomonas and other germs as well, gram-negative germs. And if we look to this paper, we see there had been 2 children infected by carbapenem-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So what is special on carbapenem resistance? This is the last antibiotic class we have. One of the last one. And behind that, it becomes complicated. So this is what we facing now. And if we look to the numbers or to a map of resistant Acinetobacter baumannii, carbapenem resistant, so last antibiotic class, then we see in the UK and in Germany we are talking about 5 to 10% resistances. But if we look for US, we are talking about 40 to 50%. If we look for Greece or Italy, we are talking about an endemic situation. So we are all traveling somewhere. We are traveling maybe to Greece and Italy to spend our vacation, and maybe some germs are traveling with us, right? So germs are spreading all over the world, and we have a real problem here. This is a paper. They took samples, and if they find Pseudomonas aeruginosa, they looked for multiresistencies. And we see that every 1/8 of the sample are multi-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And same thing with Klebsiella pneumonia, right? So there is a problem that we have to face. And one of the sources, we heard today as well, one of the sources is the zinc. So we have different contamination through the hand washing basin. We are talking about washing hands, contaminated water, biological waste. We are talking about sub-inhibitory cleaning chemicals and some cross-contamination. So in the sink, the biofilm is built. And if they're a resistant germ, then they change the resistant genes. We know that today. They change them in between the bacteria. And not only in between a Pseudomonas gives another Pseudomonas resistant genes, so the resistant genes are changed between Klebsiella and Pseudomonas as well. So this is one of the source of resistances we have to deal with. And if you look to the picture on the left side, you see that very often. Water is going directly to the sink. And what does it mean is that you have some dispersion of bacteria on the hand washing basin and on the area around that, right? And they are not the only one on the downside here. It's not the only one, the only paper that shows a transmission between those germs from sink to the patients with resistant germs. In this case, it's carbapenemase producing Enterobacteriaceae. So this is why the WHO said in 2017 that there is a real critical situation. We have to find new antibiotics for this critical classes. It's Acinetobacter baumannii, it's Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and it's Enterobacteriaceae. So there's another study, and this is a very interesting study from 22, published in The Lancet with 174 authors. It's about the global burden of bacteria antimicrobial resistances. And that shows that we have about 5 million deaths worldwide through or in relation with resistant germs, 1.3 million by resistant germs. And they estimate that in 2050, we have 10 million deaths worldwide, and then infections by resistant germs, or death through infections by resistant germs, will be number one ahead of cancer. And if we look for the research and development, then we see that we have 4,000 active ingredients in development to fight cancer and 40 to find new antibiotics. The cost, and Peter said the cost, so the costs are estimated about 55 million costs through these resistant germs per year from the CDC, and it's comparable, let's say, with Europe so far. So what can we do? The only thing we can do now is to establish a multi-barrier system, and we heard about that today. And of course, this air is a very, very important transmission way. But my question here is, I want to figure on and I want to put a spot on is, can point-of-use filter be a part of a multi-barrier system? Could it be a barrier or not? Or is it only for rejecting germs? So there are some case studies that we know that 50%, this is a study by DNA typing, 50% of the colonization and infections coming from tap water of Pseudomonas aeruginosa. There are some positive studies now that shows that there is evidence before we come to the critical one. This study shows over 24 months that we had 85% less colonizations through Pseudomonas aeruginosa from an ICU and 50%, more than 50% less infections. That was a case when the water was contaminated with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's not in every case here. Another study with Pseudomonas aeruginosa with an outbreak that could be reduced from 61 positive blood cultures to 7 positive blood cultures. All the studies are statistical relevant here. Another study from Hungary shows the same thing. They could reduce the cases per 100 patient days to 0. And the third one from a liver transplant from China, they reduced the infection rates, colonization rates as well. Statistical relevant through the use of point-of-use filters. On the other hand, this is a study that the other 50% of the Pseudomonas aeruginosa doesn't come from the water, it comes from the patient to the tap. By DNA typing and 7 strains that you find on healthcare worker hands from the patients. So there's the other way around as well, right? So what we can assume here that there's not only one way. We are talking about a multi-directional contamination pathways. From thing to tap, from tap to patient, from patient to tap, and so on. So question is, point-of-care filters or point-of-use filters can interrupt some, but can they interrupt all? And there's an interesting study from 22 made in London. And you see here that it's this contaminated contaminated water system with more than 300 CFU per mil of Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And you see that they used point-of-use filter. And you see that over the time of 15 days, it works good. But if you use them 45, 47, 52, or maybe 150 days, becomes bad. So 26 of those filters were colonized before the expiration days with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And this was a 92 days filter from a producer, right? So that means you are relying on those filters and they doesn't work. Or they become a boomerang in this case, right? So what does it mean? I think biofilm growth take place on those filters as well. And we know biofilm growth very well. There are Pseudomonas aeruginosa, one of the germs that can marvelously produce biofilm by producing extracellular polymer substances. And the interesting thing on biofilm is that it can grow on surfaces. And if you look to a tap and open a tap and see what's inside the opportunity for those Pseudomonas aeruginosa, you find a lot, right? Interesting studies about biofilm says if you have a 10-cell thick biofilm, the diffusion time of chemicals inside the biofilm takes 100 times longer than the planktonic one. So bacteria are well protected. And the last one in the row can easily develop resistances here. This is why it happens. Another study, very interesting, somebody tried to kill a biofilm by antibiotics. Here you see Pseudomonas aeruginosa and imipenem, and the planktonic counterpart, this is what is free in the water, killed by 1 microgram per mil. But for the biofilm phenotype, you need 1,000 times higher concentration. My experience is if you have a biofilm, you can fight it, and maybe the next day you don't measure some bacteria, but you cannot kill it. So what does it mean? It means that if you use a point of use filter, you need a proper biocide additive at the outside, because you have not only one contamination pathway. This is not the only job to reject germs, right? The job is to handle the contamination from outside as well. So if you use on the left side, you see if you don't use an additive and you have a contamination of 50,000 here, next day you have 200 or 250,000 of those Pseudomonas or whatever you have. And only if you use a proper additive, and please, if you do that, validate that not only for the first or 2 days, or for 14 days, as we've seen in this study. Validate that for the whole operation time that you have a proper working additive here. And be aware, if you use an additive, you have to make a biocompatibility investigation, not to harm a patient by this additive, right? This is very important. So let's look for the intended use of those filters and look for that and ask for that. So if you have a Legionella outbreak somewhere where immune competent patients are, then you don't have to care about the contamination pathways from outside. So, and you can have flexible operation time, right? But if you want to use that on a critical ward in a hospital, like a neonate or like a transplant, you have to have a definite operating time. You have to have a proper bactericid housing material. You have to avoid the direct flow to the sink. You should have clinical evidence, and the people show, or the producers or the company should show you the clinical evidence. And of course, a quality management system is needed for that. This is a medical field, and this is important to be responsible for that. Then, point-of-use filters can be a part of a multi-barrier system, but only then. So, thank you very much for your attention.